The air in my parents' house always smelled of lemon polish and regret. It was a sterile, cloying scent that clung to the perfectly fluffed cushions on the sofa, the dust-free surfaces of dark wood furniture, and the very silence that filled the spaces between the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. It was the scent of a life kept under glass, beautiful to look at, but suffocating to live within. I sit here now, nearly 50 years later, in a garden that smells of damp earth and blooming roses, and still, a faint whiff of lemon-scented cleaner can transport me back to that specific afternoon, to the precise moment my life fractured. I remember the weight of the silence in my car after I turned off the ignition in their driveway. For 15 minutes, I just sat there, the key still clutched in my hand, my knuckles white. The words I had to say were a vile, heavy stone in my gut. I'm pregnant. 3 words. Simple. Biological. A fact. But to bring them into that house, to offer them into the pristine, controlled atmosphere my father curated with such ferocious dedication, felt like an act of vandalism. I was about to shatter the flawless reflection he saw of himself in me. My hands were trembling when I finally walked up the stone path to the front door. The petunias in the window boxes were perfect, a riot of pink and white without a single dead blossom. My mother's work. She was a meticulous curator of small, beautiful things, perhaps to distract from the vast, empty spaces in her life. She opened the door before I could ring the bell, a strained, welcoming smile plastered on her face. "Emma, we didn't expect you on a weekday. Is everything all right, dear?" My mother, Helen, had a unique talent for asking a question while already fearing the answer. Her anxiety was a constant low hum, the baseline frequency of our family. "Everything's fine, Mom. I just needed to talk." She led me into the living room, the one reserved for guests who never came. It was a museum of a life well lived, or at least a life that looked good from the outside. Family photos were arranged on the mantelpiece in heavy silver frames. My father, David, looking proud at his university graduation. My mother as a young, shy bride. Me, a gap-toothed 7-year-old on a bicycle. Me, a polished 22-year-old in a cap and gown, holding a diploma that my father had paid for and considered his own. He was sitting in his usual wingback chair, the Wall Street Journal, folded neatly on the ottoman beside him. He looked up, and his face broke into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. It was his Vanguard Solutions smile, the one he reserved for me, his greatest investment. "Emma," he said, his voice full of manufactured warmth. "What a surprise. Pulling you away from the office must be like pulling teeth. Peterson isn't working you too hard, is he?" "No, Dad. Work is fine." I sat on the edge of the sofa opposite him, the stiff fabric crinkling under my weight. My mother hovered by the doorway, a nervous sentinel guarding the threshold between normalcy and whatever I was about to unleash. Small talk followed. It was our family's shield. We talked about the weather, about the neighbor's new car, about the quarterly earnings report for a company my father followed. Every word was a delicate tap dance around the screaming truth in the center of the room. My own heartbeat was a frantic drum against my ribs, so loud I was sure they could hear it. I clutched my hands in my lap, trying to stop their shaking. Finally, the charade became too heavy to bear. The polite words died in my throat. My father must have sensed the shift, the drop in atmospheric pressure. He lowered his paper, his smile fading, replaced by a look of cautious inquiry. "Is something wrong, Emma? You look pale." My mother drifted closer, wringing a delicate embroidered handkerchief in her hands. "Are you not feeling well, dear?" "I have some ginger ale." I took a breath, and the polished air felt like sandpaper in my lungs. "I'm pregnant." The words fell into the silence, small and yet cataclysmic. They landed and spread, a dark stain on the pristine beige carpet. The grandfather clock in the hall seemed to stop ticking. My mother let out a tiny, wounded gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. Her eyes, wide with panic, darted immediately to my father, seeking his reaction, his instruction on how she should feel. My father did not move. He did not gasp. He did not show shock or anger or even sadness. His face, for a long, terrifying moment, was a complete blank. Then, his eyes, which were a pale, watery blue, narrowed slightly. He looked at me, but it felt like he was performing a complex calculation, his gaze distant. He wasn't seeing his daughter, a scared young woman on the precipice of a life-altering event. He was seeing a variable, an unexpected complication in a long-term financial plan. I think, even then, a small, naive part of me was waiting for him to get up, to cross the small space between us and hold me, to say, "It's going to be okay." I was waiting for the father from the television shows, the one who was supposed to be a protector, a safe harbor. The man in the wingback chair was not that father. He leaned forward, the leather of his chair groaning in protest. He rested his elbows on his knees, steepling his fingers in front of him, a gesture I had seen him use 1,000 times in business meetings. It was his "let's get down to brass tacks" pose. And I remember, with a clarity that still chills me, the first thing he asked. It wasn't, "Are you okay?" or "Who is the father?" or "What are you going to do?" He leaned forward, his eyes cold and sharp with an unnerving lucidity, and asked, "Is your job safe?" In that moment, I knew I was utterly alone. The fragile hope I had carried into that house shattered into a million tiny, sharp pieces. It was a betrayal so profound, so complete, that it stole the air from my lungs. The question wasn't about me. It was about my utility, my value, my position at Vanguard Solutions, the prestigious tech firm where I was a rising star, the job that was the cornerstone of his reflected glory. I couldn't speak. I could only stare at him, my mind reeling. My mother, taking her cue from him, began to whisper, her voice a frantic, horrified hiss from the doorway. "Oh, David, oh, Emma, your career, what will people say? Mr. Peterson, does he know?" "Helen, be quiet," my father said, his voice low and sharp, not even glancing at her. His eyes were still locked on me, pinning me to the sofa. "Emma, answer me. Does Richard Peterson know about this situation?" The way he said "situation," as if my pregnancy were a hostile takeover bid, made my stomach clench. "No," I managed to whisper, the words scraping my throat. He nodded slowly, a grim satisfaction on his face. "Good." "That's good. We have time then. We can manage this." "Manage this?" The words came out louder than I intended, laced with a disbelief that bordered on hysteria. "Dad, I don't know what to do. I'm scared." "There is nothing to be scared of," he countered, his tone clipped and devoid of any empathy. "There are options. There are procedures. This is a problem, and problems have solutions. We just need to find the most practical one. The one with the least amount of fallout." He spoke as if we were discussing a leaky faucet. His pragmatism was a bludgeon, beating down my fear and confusion until there was nothing left but a cold, hard knot of despair. He started pacing, his steps measured on the thick rug, his mind already churning through logistics. "You're what, 10 weeks? 12? He asked, not looking at me. "There are clinics." "Discreet, professional. It can be handled quickly." "You'd only need to take a day or two off work, a sick day. No one would have to know anything." "Vanguard, your future there, is the most important thing right now. We've invested too much to let a youthful indiscretion derail it all." We've invested too much. He wasn't talking about love or care. He was talking about my tuition, the cost of my professional wardrobe, the social capital he gained by telling his golf buddies that his daughter was a top performer at one of the most respected companies in Columbus. I was his blue-chip stock, and I had just threatened to plummet in value. "David?" my mother whimpered, finally finding her voice. Maybe she needs a moment." "She doesn't need a moment, Helen," he snapped. "She needs a plan. Moments are a luxury we don't have. Reputations are built over decades and destroyed in an instant. Emma knows that. She's a smart girl." He stopped pacing and looked at me, a flicker of something that might have been warning in his eyes. "You understand, don't you, Emma? What's at stake here?" I did. But what I thought was at stake, my health, my sanity, my future, was not what he meant. He was talking about his reflection. His legacy, the smooth upward trajectory he had charted for me, for himself, through me, The pregnancy was a flaw in the design, a crack in the porcelain doll he'd so carefully crafted. And his only instinct was to hide the crack, or better yet, dispose of the flawed piece altogether. I looked from his cold, determined face to my mother's frightened, pleading one. She offered no defense for me. She was a mirror, reflecting his priorities back at him. Her fear wasn't for me, but of him, of the disruption I was causing in her fragile, carefully maintained peace. She was another guardian of the museum, and I had just tracked mud all over the floor. "I have to go," I said, my voice flat. I stood up on shaky legs. The room felt tilted, the air too thin. "We haven't finished our discussion," my father said, his tone authoritative. "We haven't decided on a course of action." "There's nothing to decide," I replied, the numbness spreading through me, a welcome anesthetic. "I heard you." I walked towards the door, moving like an automaton. My mother stepped aside, her hand fluttering near my arm but not daring to touch me. She looked at me with an expression of such pitiful sorrow, but it wasn't for me. It was for the disruption, for the unpleasantness of it all. As I reached the front door, my father's voice stopped me one last time. It was softer now, laced with a tone he probably thought was kind, but was actually the most cruel of all. "Emma," he said, "don't be emotional about this. Think of it like any other challenge at work. Assess the problem, identify the optimal solution, and execute. Don't risk your job. It's the safest bet." The safest bet? For whom, I wondered. I walked out of that house, closing the door softly behind me. I didn't slam it. I didn't scream. The grief was too deep for that. It was a silent, internal collapse. As I got back into my car, the scent of lemon polish seemed to follow me, clinging to my clothes. I sat there for a long time, not crying, just staring at the perfect house, the perfect petunias, the perfect life I was never truly a part of. The stone in my gut was still there, but it was different now. It was no longer just the weight of my secret. It was the weight of knowing, with absolute certainty, that I had no home to run to. I was entirely, irrevocably on my own, and the world had never felt so cold. To understand the man who would ruin my life, you must first understand the dream he sold me. It was a beautiful, shining dream, and for a long time, I believed it was mine. My father's cold dismissal had been a kind of death, the death of a daughter's faith. But long before that, Richard Peterson had offered me a resurrection. He had offered me an identity so compelling, so intoxicating, that it replaced everything else. My job wasn't just a job, it was my calling, my purpose, my shield. And he was its architect. Leaving my parents' house that afternoon, the world felt gray and muted, as if all the color had been bled from it. But my memory, unbidden, flashed back to a different day, 2 years prior, a day saturated with light and possibility. It was my first day at Vanguard Solutions. The elevator that carried me up to the 35th floor was itself a statement. It was silent, impossibly fast, and paneled in brushed steel. It didn't just ascend, it launched you into another world. The doors opened not into a lobby, but into a panorama. The entire floor was a testament to success, a cathedral of glass and light. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the building, offering a godlike view of Columbus stretching out below, the threads of highways, the brick-and-mortar tapestry of the city, the glinting ribbon of the Scioto River. The air smelled of expensive coffee and something clean and vaguely electric, the hum of powerful computers and even more powerful minds. Compared to the stifling, antique-filled silence of my parents' home in Maple Creek, this was another planet. This was the future. It was everything I had yearned for: speed, light, importance. People moved with a quiet, focused energy, their conversations low and urgent. They were dressed in sharp, tailored clothing that spoke of effortless confidence. I, in my slightly too stiff new suit from a department store, felt like an imposter, a girl from a state university who had somehow slipped through a crack in the universe to land among the elite. I spent the first few months in a state of terrified awe, keeping my head down, completing my assigned tasks with painstaking precision. I was an analyst, a number cruncher at the bottom of a very tall, very slick pyramid. I spoke only when spoken to and tried to make myself as small as possible, certain that at any moment someone would tap me on the shoulder and tell me there had been a terrible mistake. And then came the quarterly strategy meeting. It was held in the main boardroom, a vast space dominated by a monolithic black granite table that felt like it could host treaty signings. I was there only to take notes, a fly on the wall among 24 of the company's senior executives. They were debating a new market entry strategy, and the discussion had stalled. The room was thick with expensive cologne and intellectual stalemate. Richard Peterson sat at the head of the table. I had only ever seen him from a distance, a charismatic figure on a stage at company-wide town halls. Up close, his presence was even more potent. He was in his late 40s with a head of thick, perfectly styled salt and pepper hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from pleasant, sun-tanned granite. He wasn't just handsome. He radiated a kind of kinetic energy, an absolute certainty that drew all the focus in the room to him. When he listened, he leaned forward with an intensity that made you feel like your words were the most important thing in the world. As they argued in circles, my mind wandered to the data sets I had been processing all week. A pattern I'd noticed, a small, anomalous correlation in customer behavior that everyone else had dismissed as statistical noise, suddenly clicked into place with what they were saying. Without thinking, without meaning to, I spoke. "It might be the service integration," I said. My voice was a tiny, reedy thing in that vast room. Everyone stopped and turned to look at me, the silent note-taker in the corner. I felt a hot blush creep up my neck. I wanted the floor to swallow me whole. "What was that, Ms.?" Peterson asked, his brow furrowed in curiosity, not annoyance. "Vance," I stammered. "Emma Vance." The data from the pilot program. It shows that customer retention isn't linked to the core product's price point, which is what we've been assuming. It's directly correlated to the perceived quality of the post-sale support. They're not buying a product, they're buying a partnership. The strategy might be targeting the wrong value proposition. Silence. I was sure I was going to be fired on the spot for my impertinence. One of the vice presidents, a man with a severe haircut, opened his mouth to dismiss me, but Richard Peterson held up a hand. He looked at me, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face. It was like watching the sun rise. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, his voice resonating through the room. "The partnership economy. She's right. We've been selling them a car, when what they really want is a chauffeur." He looked around the table at his stunned VPs. "Why haven't any of you brought me this?" Then his eyes came back to me, and they were full of a light that made me feel like the most brilliant person on earth. "Emma Vance. Thank you. You just saved us a month of pointless debate." That was the beginning. It was the first dose of a drug I would become hopelessly addicted to, his approval. From that day on, I was no longer invisible. He didn't just give me a job, he gave me a dream. A beautiful, shining dream that he held in his fist. He would let me look at it, but I was never allowed to hold it myself. He plucked me from my junior analyst role and placed me on a special projects team, working directly under his supervision. My peers looked on with a mixture of awe and envy, which only served to isolate me further, pushing me deeper into his orbit. "You have a clarity of thought I don't see often, Emma," he would say, his voice a low, confidential murmur. "There's a ceiling for most people. I don't think you have one." He became my mentor, my champion. He gave me books to read, articles to analyze, and then would call me into his office at the end of the day to discuss them. His office was a corner suite, even larger and more breathtaking than the boardroom. It felt like being on the bridge of a starship. As the rest of the office emptied out, the lights of the city would begin to glitter below, and we would be the only two people left on the 35th floor. Two brilliant minds, I thought, shaping the future of the company. It felt less like work and more like a secret, elite club of two. The grooming was masterful because it was disguised as opportunity. It began with the late nights. "Emma, could you stick around for a bit?" he'd ask, his tone casual. "I need a fresh pair of eyes on the quarterly report before it goes to the board." At first, it was thrilling. I was 23 years old, and the CEO of Vanguard Solutions valued my opinion. I would call my father and tell him, and I could hear the pride swelling in his voice. "That's my girl," he'd say. See? Hard work pays off. I was finally earning the one currency he truly valued, success. But the late nights became a pattern. The bustling office would grow quiet, the energy draining away until it was just the two of us, surrounded by the silent, sleeping city. The conversations would slowly drift from work. He'd ask about my family, my dreams, my fears. He presented himself as a confidant, a safe harbor for my ambitions. He was creating an intimacy that was entirely inappropriate, but I was too young and too dazzled to see it. Then came the casual touches. A hand on my back as he guided me through a doorway, a gesture that seemed polite but lingered just a second too long. His fingers brushing mine as he handed me a document. Leaning over my desk to look at my screen, his arm pressing against my shoulder, his chin so close to my head I could smell his expensive aftershave. Each touch was a tiny transgression, small enough to be deniable. If I flinched or pulled away, I would be the one making it awkward. I would be the one misinterpreting a simple, friendly gesture, so I learned not to flinch. I learned to tolerate the slow, systematic erosion of my own boundaries. The gifts started soon after. They were never overtly personal, always framed as professional tools. The first was a slim, elegant laptop. "The one the company issued you is too slow. You can't be held back by second-rate equipment," he said, waving off my protests. Then came a beautiful, soft leather briefcase. "You're going to be in meetings with our biggest clients. You need to look the part." Once, after I'd worked 3 nights in a row to finish a proposal, he handed me an envelope. Inside was a $500 gift certificate to the city's most exclusive department store. "A bonus for a job well done," he said with a warm smile. "Invest in your professional image, Emma. It's part of the game." I remember standing in that store, surrounded by clothes I could never have afforded, feeling a dizzying mix of gratitude and unease. The gift felt too big, too personal. It created a sense of obligation, a debt that couldn't be repaid by simply doing my job well. But what could I do? To refuse it would be an insult. It would be ungrateful. It would be risking the golden opportunity he had handed me. So I bought a suit, and when I wore it, I felt his ownership of me woven into the very fabric. He was building a cage around me, and he was calling it a promotion. Every compliment was another bar. Every exclusive opportunity was another lock on the door. He was isolating me, making me entirely dependent on his goodwill, all under the guise of mentorship. And I was a willing participant. I worked tirelessly, fueled by his praise and the intoxicating thrill of my own ascent. The small, gnawing feelings of discomfort were easy to push aside, to label as my own insecurity. He was Richard Peterson, a giant of the industry. I was Emma Vance, a nobody he had chosen. I wasn't just lucky, I was blessed. I see now that he was an architect of the highest order. He wasn't just building a company, he was building a narrative, and he needed a cast of characters to play their parts. He was the benevolent genius, and I was his brilliant protege. It was a story he told to the board, to his clients, to my father, and most of all to me. I clung to that role because it was so much better than being the overlooked daughter from Maple Creek. It gave me a sense of self-worth that I had craved my entire life. I didn't realize then that the price of the role was myself. He wasn't building me up. He was hollowing me out so that he could fill the space with whatever he wanted. And soon, the unspoken price of my ambition would be called due. The validation I received at the office became a currency I could spend at home. Each success at Vanguard, each word of praise from Richard Peterson, was a deposit into an account of familial pride managed exclusively by my father. He had never been able to applaud my character, my kindness, or my humor. Those were assets with no market value. But my proximity to power, my rising status in a world he revered, that was something he could understand. It was something he could boast about. My father worshipped Richard Peterson. To him, my boss wasn't a man. He was a symbol of everything he had failed to become. My success was his second chance, and he would not let me fail him. About 6 months into my new role as Peterson's protege, my parents insisted on holding a celebratory dinner. It wasn't a question, but a command performance. "We need to properly acknowledge how well you're doing, Emma," my father had said over the phone, his voice booming with a pride that was both suffocating and demanding. "Your mother will make her roast chicken." And so I found myself, on a crisp autumn Sunday, driving back to the museum in Maple Creek. The leaves on the maple trees that lined their street were a riot of gold and crimson, a fiery, beautiful death. It felt fitting. I was thriving, by all external measures, yet I felt a part of myself withering with each passing week. The long hours, the constant pressure to be brilliant, the subtle, cloying web of Peterson's attention, it was all taking its toll. There were persistent, dark smudges under my eyes that no amount of concealer could hide, and my new suit, the one bought with his gift certificate, hung a little more loosely than it had a few months ago. I walked into the house, and the familiar scent of lemon polish was layered with the aroma of roasting meat. My mother greeted me with a kiss on the cheek that felt dry and papery. Her eyes, clouded with their usual anxiety, scanned my face. "Oh, Emma, you look exhausted," she said, her voice a worried whisper. "Are you eating properly? You're so thin." "I hope that man isn't working you into an early grave." There was a flicker of genuine concern there, but it was quickly extinguished by the arrival of my father. "Nonsense, Helen," he boomed, striding in from the living room. He was wearing a cashmere sweater I knew was reserved for special occasions. "She looks like a winner. That's the look of someone on the fast track. It's called dedication." He wrapped an arm around my shoulders, a gesture that was less of a hug and more of a claim of ownership. "She gets it from me." The dinner was staged in the formal dining room, a room we used maybe twice a year. The good china, with its delicate floral pattern, was laid out on a starched white tablecloth. The crystal glasses, which my mother spent hours polishing, gleamed under the light of the chandelier. It was a perfect tableau, a stage set for the performance of a happy, successful family. I was the star of the show, and yet I felt like a ghost at my own feast. As my mother shuttled back and forth from the kitchen with platters of food, the roast chicken, golden but dry, the green beans perfectly steamed but bland, the mashed potatoes smooth but tasteless, my father held court. The topic, as always, was Vanguard Solutions and its brilliant CEO. "I was reading in Forbes," he began, carving the chicken with surgical precision, "that Vanguard's new expansion into the European market is considered the most aggressive and intelligent move in the tech sector this year. That was Peterson's doing, wasn't it, Emma?" "You mentioned he was personally overseeing the transition." "Yes," I said, pushing a green bean around my plate. "He's very hands-on with all major projects." "That's the mark of a true leader," my father declared to my mother, as if she were a visiting dignitary. "Not some pencil pusher in an ivory tower. A man of action. He's a titan, a real titan of industry." I listened as my father recounted stories I had told him, anecdotes I'd shared in moments of weariness that he had polished into shining examples of my prestigious life. A difficult client I had helped win over became Emma's strategic victory. A complex report I had spent a weekend finishing became the analysis that saved the quarterly forecast. He was the storyteller, and I was the protagonist of an epic he was writing. I barely recognized myself in his version of my life. "And Peterson sees it," he continued, pointing at me with his fork. "He sees your value. A man like that doesn't waste his time on mediocrity. He's investing in you, Emma. That's an honor." My mother nodded along, her expression a careful blend of pride and attentiveness. "It's just wonderful, dear. We're so proud of you. Your father tells everyone at the club about your successes." I felt a wave of dizziness. The room was too warm, the praise too loud, the gap between their perception and my reality, a gaping chasm. My reality was spending last night until 11 p.m. in Peterson's silent office, his presence a heavy weight beside me as we finalized a presentation. My reality was the way he'd let his hand rest on my chair back, his fingers just brushing the nape of my neck as he'd leaned in to point something out on the screen. My reality was the suffocating feeling of being perpetually watched, evaluated, and owned. I tried to inject a note of that reality into the perfect performance. "It's a lot of pressure," I said, my voice sounding small. "Mr. Peterson, he expects a lot. The hours are demanding." My mother's smile faltered for a second. "Well, dear, you must make sure you're taking your vitamins." My father, however, set down his knife and fork with a deliberate clatter. He looked at me, his brow furrowed not with sympathy, but with something that looked like disappointment, like I had just revealed a critical character flaw. "Pressure?" he said, the word dripping with disdain. "Of course there's pressure. Diamonds are made under pressure, Emma. Did you think success was going to be easy? Did you think a man like Richard Peterson got where he is by working 9 to 5? No, of course not," I stammered, already regretting my moment of honesty. "It's just, sometimes it feels like it's all-consuming." "That's what it takes to get to the top, Emma," he said, his voice lowering into a lecture. "Don't be weak. Weakness is a luxury you can't afford." "Not now. Not when you have the opportunity of a lifetime. You think I didn't feel pressure when I was your age? I would have killed for an opportunity like the one you have, for a mentor like Peterson to take an interest in me." There it was. His own history of quiet failures, of middle management obscurity, laid bare on the dinner table. My success wasn't for me. It was to rectify his past. My accomplishments were the balm for his old wounds. Any complaint from me wasn't a cry for help. It was an insult to the vicarious victory he was savoring. To him, my exhaustion wasn't a symptom of a problem. It was the problem itself. It was weakness. He raised his crystal glass of water, a grand theatrical gesture. "To Richard Peterson," he announced, looking around the table as if it were packed with shareholders. "A man who recognizes talent and isn't afraid to cultivate it. And to my daughter Emma, for being smart enough to seize the opportunity he's given her." My mother raised her glass immediately, a watery smile fixed on her face. I felt my own hand rise, as if moved by an external force. I clinked my glass against theirs, the sound echoing in the quiet room. The toast felt like a sentence. I was being celebrated for my own erasure. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of my father's monologues and my monosyllabic replies. My mind had retreated, gone back to the gleaming glass tower downtown where I felt more real, if only because the stakes were clearer. At Vanguard, I was a high-value asset. Here, in this stifling dining room, I was the embodiment of a deferred dream, a proxy in a race my father had already lost. Both roles required me to be silent, compliant, and grateful. As I was leaving, my mother pressed a container of leftover chicken into my hands. "You need to eat more," she whispered, her hand briefly touching my cheek. It was the only moment of genuine, unscripted warmth in the entire evening, but it was fleeting, gone as soon as my father approached. "Remember what I said, Emma," he said, standing in the doorway, a formidable silhouette against the hall light. "Focus, dedication. Don't let anything distract you. You're a Vance. We're not quitters." Driving back to my small, quiet apartment, the container of dry chicken sitting on the passenger seat beside me, I felt the unspoken price of it all settle over me. The price of my father's pride was my silence. The price of my mother's peace was my compliance. The price of Richard Peterson's mentorship was a piece of my soul I hadn't yet realized was missing. They were all so proud of the woman they thought I was becoming, and I was beginning to be terrified of her. The successful, dedicated, uncomplaining woman on the fast track. Her existence depended on my slow, quiet disappearance. And I was letting it happen. The slow, creeping dread that had become my constant companion was not a premonition of a single, catastrophic event. It was the rational response to a trap closing in slow motion. Traps, I've learned, are rarely sudden. The most effective ones are those you walk into willingly, believing the path is one of your own choosing. You acclimate to the narrowing walls, you adjust to the dimming light, and you mistake the scent of the bait for the perfume of success. The click of the lock, when it finally comes, is not a surprise. It is an inevitability you have simply refused to see. The project that sealed my fate was a landmark deal for Vanguard, a multi-year contract with a logistics giant that would solidify our position as the market leader. I had been instrumental in it. My analysis had identified the client's core vulnerability, and my presentation deck had been the blueprint for our winning proposal. For 3 months, I had lived and breathed the deal, working 70-hour weeks, fueled by adrenaline and Peterson's relentless encouragement. When the news came through that we had won, the relief was so profound it was almost painful. "We did it, Emma," Peterson had said, his voice a low, triumphant purr over the phone. He was in Chicago for the final negotiations. "And I mean we. This victory is yours as much as it is mine. I'm flying back tonight. We have to celebrate. Just the two of us. I'll book a table at the Embers. The Embers was a place I'd only ever read about. It was a dark, hushed temple of stake and power, where deals were signed in quiet booths over bottles of wine that cost more than my monthly rent. To refuse would have been unthinkable. It would have been churlish, ungrateful. It would have broken the narrative of our partnership, and so I agreed. I wore the suit his gift had paid for, the fabric feeling like a costume against my skin. The restaurant was even more intimidating than I had imagined. It was all dark wood, deep leather, and the soft clinking of heavy silverware. We were led to a corner booth that afforded us both privacy and a commanding view of the room. Richard Peterson moved through the space with the easy grace of a man who owned it. The host greeted him by name. The waiter approached with deference. I was an accessory to his power, and I had never felt more out of place. He ordered a bottle of red wine that was older than I was. "To the victor go the spoils," he said, raising his glass to me. His eyes glittered in the low light. "You were magnificent, Emma, truly. I've never seen a strategic mind like yours in someone so young." The praise, which had once been a source of intoxicating validation, now felt cloying, heavy. But I drank it in, along with the wine. I let him fill my glass again and again. He talked about the future, our future. He painted a picture of an empire we would build together. He spoke of my inevitable rise to the executive team, of a partnership track, of a life of influence and wealth that was mine for the taking. He was selling me my own ambition, and I was buying it, because the alternative was to admit the truth of my situation, and I was not brave enough for that. He talked about his own life, painting a picture of a lonely man at the top. He spoke of his wife, Eleanor, with a kind of weary affection, describing her as a wonderful woman who simply didn't understand the pressures of his world. "She lives in a different reality," he sighed, swirling the wine in his glass. "But you understand what it takes. You understand me." He was drawing a circle around the two of us, separating us from the rest of the world. In this intimate, wine-soaked bubble, we were a team of two, a secret alliance. My professional judgment was clouded by the alcohol and the potent cocktail of his flattery. The lines, which had been blurring for months, now dissolved completely. He insisted on driving me home. "It's the least I can do for my star player," he said, his hand on the small of my back as he guided me out of the restaurant. The gesture, once a source of quiet discomfort, now felt possessive, proprietary. In the plush silence of his German sedan, the city lights sliding past the windows, the air grew thick. His hand, which had been resting on the center console, moved to cover mine. I didn't pull away. I was frozen, a specimen pinned to a board. When we arrived at my apartment building, he turned off the engine. He didn't just walk me to the door. He walked me up the 3 flights of stairs to my landing, his presence behind me, a heavy, ominous weight. At my door, I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking. This was the moment of departure, the point where the evening was supposed to end. "Thank you for dinner," I said, my voice thin. "It was..." "The night's not over," he said, his voice different now. The warmth was gone, replaced by a low, guttural certainty. He took the keys from my trembling hand and unlocked the door himself, pushing it open and guiding me inside with a firm pressure on my back. He closed the door behind us, and the sound of the latch clicking shut was the loudest sound I had ever heard. The assault wasn't a single moment of violence. It was the final brick being laid in a prison he had been building around me for months. And the pregnancy, that was the lock on the door. He didn't use force, not in the way people imagine. He didn't have to. His power was the force. My fear was the force. The career he held in his hands was the force. He used my ambition, my silence, and my complicity against me. He had spent a year convincing me that my value was tied to his approval, and in that small, cheap apartment, he cashed in his investment. My mind detached. I floated up to the ceiling and watched the scene unfold below me as if it were happening to a stranger. I focused on a small hairline crack in the plaster above the door. I traced its path with my eyes, a tiny, meaningless river in a sea of white. I counted the sounds from the street outside, a passing siren, the rumble of a late-night bus, The laughter of a group of students heading home. I was there, and I was not there. It was the only way to survive it. He was a conqueror planting a flag on newly acquired territory. It was not an act of passion. It was an act of ownership. And when it was over, he stood up, straightened his tie, and looked at me, lying motionless on my own bed with an expression of cool satisfaction. "You're a valuable asset, Emma," he said, his voice once again the smooth, professional tone of a CEO. "Don't ever forget that." Then he turned and left, closing the door softly behind him. The days that followed were a gray, featureless fog. I went to work. I sat at my desk. I moved my mouse. I typed words that made no sense to me. I was a ghost haunting my own life. The office, once my sanctuary, was now a mausoleum. Every corridor, every conference room echoed with his presence, and he, in the ultimate act of psychological cruelty, acted as if nothing had happened. He was cheerful, professional, praising my work in a team meeting the very next morning. His normalcy was a form of madness, a silent, screaming accusation that what had happened was either a figment of my imagination or, worse, so insignificant to him that it required no acknowledgement at all. I was drowning in silence. And then, about 6 weeks later, my body sent up a flare. A nausea that I'd been dismissing as stress became a constant, unwelcome companion. The bone-deep weariness I'd blamed on overwork became an anchor, dragging me down. And then came the undeniable truth of a missed cycle, then another. Denial is a powerful anesthetic, but reality has a way of cutting through it. I remember standing in the sterile, white-tiled bathroom of my apartment, the one place that felt truly mine, holding a small plastic stick. The silence was absolute as I waited, and then they appeared. 2 faint pink lines. An unambiguous biological fact. A confirmation. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply stared at the positive result, and the fog that had enveloped my mind for weeks finally began to recede, replaced by a cold, sharp terror. The disassociated numbness shattered, and I was brutally, violently slammed back into my own body. This was real. It wasn't a nightmare I could wake up from. It was a consequence, a living, growing consequence, taking root inside me. The prison he had built now had a permanent warden. The trap had not just closed, it had become a part of me. Staring at those 2 pink lines, I understood that I had reached the point of no return. My life, as I had known it, was over, and a new one, a terrifying one, was just beginning. It was this living, breathing secret that I would carry days later into the suffocating, lemon-scented silence of my parents' living room. Following my father's counsel was not a choice. It was the only strategy left to a soldier with no weapons, no allies, and no ground to stand on. His words, as cold and sharp as surgical steel, had excised the last vestiges of hope from my heart. He had given me my marching orders: endure, be silent, survive. And so I returned to the gleaming glass tower of Vanguard Solutions, not as Emma Vance, the rising star, but as a spy in my own life, a deep-cover agent whose mission was to feign normalcy at all costs. The office, once a landscape of opportunity, now felt like a minefield. Every casual, "How are you?" was a question I couldn't answer honestly. Every friendly smile felt like a spotlight threatening to expose the secret I was carrying. My body had become a traitor, and I lived in constant fear of its betrayal. The metallic taste of morning sickness would rise in my throat during team meetings, and I'd swallow it down with a gulp of water, my knuckles white under the conference table. The exhaustion was a physical weight, a leaden cloak I dragged with me down the long, silent corridors. I learned to map out the locations of every restroom, to time my coffee breaks to moments when Peterson was in meetings, to make my physical presence as small and unobtrusive as possible. I knew, however, that a confrontation was inevitable. Richard Peterson was not a man from whom things could be hidden. He moved through his company like a sovereign, aware of every tremor, every shift in the atmosphere. He was the sun, and I was a rogue planet whose orbit had become erratic. It was only a matter of time before he exerted his gravitational pull. The summons came on a Tuesday afternoon. It wasn't a call or a casual drop-by. It was a formal calendar invitation from his executive assistant, a severe woman named Patricia, whose efficiency was legendary. The subject line was stark. Meeting. The location, Mr. Peterson's office. The time, 4:00 p.m. There was a finality to it, a lack of ambiguity that sent a jolt of pure, cold adrenaline through me. This was it. The hours leading up to the meeting were a masterclass in psychological torment. I sat at my desk, staring at a spreadsheet of data that blurred into a meaningless jumble of numbers. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic trapped bird. I played out every scenario in my mind, each one worse than the last. He would fire me, citing some trumped-up performance issue. He would threaten me, blackmail me, shame me into resigning. He would call me a liar, a slut, an opportunist. I braced myself for a hurricane of rage and recrimination. When Patricia's disembodied voice came over my desk phone at 3:59 p.m., "Mr. Peterson is ready for you now, Emma," I felt a strange sense of relief. The waiting, at least, was over. The walk down the hallway to his corner suite felt a mile long. The plush gray carpet muffled my footsteps, the silence amplifying the frantic beating of my own heart. I felt the eyes of my colleagues on my back, their curiosity a palpable force. The special assistant, walking the green mile. I smoothed down my dress, took a deep breath that did nothing to calm me, and pushed open the heavy glass door. He was not sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, the throne from which he usually ran his empire. He was standing by the vast window, looking out at the city below, his hands clasped behind his back. The late afternoon sun backlit his silhouette, turning him into an imposing dark figure against the brilliant sky. "Emma," he said, turning around. His face was not angry. It was arranged in an expression of solemn, gentle concern. "Come in." "Close the door. Please, have a seat." He gestured to one of the two soft leather armchairs that faced the window, a space usually reserved for honored clients, not junior employees. He remained standing, a deliberate choice that immediately established his dominance in the room. I sat on the edge of the chair, my back ramrod straight, my hands clutching my purse in my lap like a shield. He was silent for a long moment, studying me. His gaze was intense, not with anger, but with a kind of clinical assessment that was far more unsettling. "I've been worried about you, Emma," he began, his voice a low, paternal murmur. "You haven't been yourself these past few weeks. You're pale." Distracted. "I had Patricia look at your keycard logs. You've been coming in late, leaving early." "That's not like you." My blood ran cold. He had been monitoring me. "I'm sorry," I mumbled, my eyes fixed on a point on the carpet. "I haven't been feeling well." "I know," he said softly. He moved from the window and sat in the chair opposite me, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees, creating an illusion of intimacy. "And I think I know why." "You're pregnant, aren't you?" He didn't ask it as a question. He stated it as a fact. The air left my lungs in a silent rush. There was no point in denying it. I could only give a small, jerky nod, a confession, and a surrender, all in one. I braced for the explosion. It never came. Instead, a look of profound, theatrical sadness crossed his face. He reached out and, for a fleeting second, placed his hand over mine, where they clutched my purse. The touch was light, but it felt like a brand. "Oh, Emma," he sighed, his voice dripping with disappointment. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you feel you could come to me? After everything, I thought we were partners. I thought you trusted me." The audacity of it was breathtaking. He was casting himself as the victim, the wounded confidant. He was twisting my fear into a betrayal of him. I was so stunned, so completely thrown off balance by this tactic, that I couldn't form a coherent thought, let alone a response. He stood up and began to pace, his expression now one of a man burdened by a great responsibility. "This is a complication, it's true," he said, as if thinking aloud. "A serious one, but it's not insurmountable. Nothing is if we manage it correctly. The first thing is to ensure your health and well-being. The stress of your current role, the long hours, the team management, it's too much for you in your condition." He was going to fire me. This was the gentle lead-in. He stopped pacing and looked at me, a decisive gleam in his eye. "Which is why, effective immediately, I'm promoting you. I'm creating a new position, special assistant to the CEO. You'll report only to me, Your work will consist of high-level strategic projects that you can manage from a private office. It comes with a significant salary increase, of course, double your current compensation. I stared at him, dumbfounded. My mind was a sputtering engine, unable to process the information. A promotion? Double my salary? It made no sense. He continued, his voice gaining momentum, the voice of a man unveiling a brilliant, benevolent plan. And this apartment you're in, it's not suitable. The commute is draining you. You need comfort, you need security, you need to be looked after. He walked over to his desk and picked up a single sheet of paper. The company has taken the liberty of leasing a new apartment for you at the residences at Northgate. It's 5 minutes from here, fully furnished. 2 bedrooms, a gym, a pool, a 24-hour concierge. All expenses will be covered by the company, of course. Consider it part of your new compensation package. He held the paper out to me. On it was an address and a set of keys taped to the corner. I didn't move. I couldn't. I finally understood. This wasn't a life raft. It was a cage, a beautiful, luxurious, gilded cage. The promotion was to isolate me. The salary was to buy me. The apartment was to contain me. He was severing my ties to my colleagues, making me utterly financially dependent, and moving me into a location of his choosing, all under the guise of paternalistic concern. I don't know what to say, I whispered. You don't have to say anything, he said, his smile returning, warm and reassuring. I'm taking care of it. I'm taking care of us. We are going to get through this together, Emma. You and I. This baby, our baby, will be provided for. But our work, our future must be protected. This is the best way, the only way. Our baby. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. He had now laid claim to the life inside me. He wasn't just my boss, my abuser. He was positioning himself as my protector, my provider, the co-author of my life. He was absorbing my entire existence into his own. I expected him to fire me. Instead, he promoted me. He told me he would take care of us. It was the most terrifying thing he had ever said. I finally reached out a trembling hand and took the paper from him. The metal of the keys was cold against my skin. To refuse would have been to declare war, a war I could not win. My father's words echoed in my mind. Don't risk your job. It's the safest bet. Richard Peterson had just made the job impossible to leave. He had outmaneuvered me so completely, so brilliantly, that he had left me with no choice but to accept his kindness. I left his office in a daze, clutching the keys to my new prison. I walked past my old desk, a place that now seemed to belong to another person in another lifetime. I didn't go back to my apartment. I went to the address on the paper. The concierge greeted me by name. The apartment was stunning, with panoramic views and furniture that smelled brand new. It was beautiful. It was silent. It was a cage. And as I stood in the center of the vast, empty living room, I knew that my compliance had just been purchased at a price so high I could never hope to repay it. I was his now, completely. Life in the cage was predictably luxurious and exquisitely lonely. My new apartment at the residences at Northgate was a masterpiece of minimalist design. It had pale hardwood floors, vast windows that drank in the sky, and furniture so artfully arranged it looked like a photograph from an architectural magazine. From my living room, I could see the lights of the city I had once longed to conquer, now spread out beneath me like a carpet I was forbidden to walk on. The 24-hour concierge, a kind man named Leo, would greet me with a warm, professional smile, accepting deliveries of groceries I hadn't ordered, and dry cleaning I hadn't dropped off, all arranged by Patricia, Mr. Peterson's ever-efficient assistant. I was a pampered prisoner, a well-cared-for veal calf, and the silence of the apartment was my fattening pen. My new office at Vanguard was a smaller, windowless version of the same cage. It was a private interior room on the 35th floor, just down the hall from Peterson's suite. The official reason for the space was to allow me to work on sensitive strategic projects without distraction. The actual reason was to sever my last remaining ties to my colleagues and keep me under constant, direct surveillance. My projects were vague and often pointless. market analyses for sectors we'd never enter, competitor reviews that were filed away and never read. They were busy work, designed to maintain the fiction of my promotion while ensuring I remained occupied and isolated. Peterson would check in on me daily, his paternalistic concern a constant suffocating pressure. "How are you feeling today, Emma?" "Are you eating well? Patricia has arranged for a catered lunch to be sent up for you. We need to make sure you and the baby are getting the right nutrients." He was managing my body as he would manage a corporate asset, optimizing it for performance, his performance. He was the farmer, and I was the prize-winning crop. For the first few weeks, I moved through this new reality in a state of deep, depressive shock. I did my work. I ate the food that was brought to me. I went home to the silent, beautiful apartment. Despair was a thick, heavy blanket I pulled over my head, hoping that if I stayed still enough, the world would simply cease to exist. But despair, I learned, is an unstable element. Left in the dark, under enough pressure, it doesn't just dissipate. It compresses, it hardens, it transforms into something else entirely. For me, it transformed into a cold, quiet, and meticulously patient rage. I remember the exact moment of the shift. I was standing in front of the floor-to-ceiling window in my apartment, looking down at the tiny, anonymous people on the street below. He had imprisoned me up here, high above the world, turning me into a spectator of life rather than a participant. He thought he was burying me. He didn't realize he was planting a seed. In that moment, a decision crystallized in my mind, as hard and clear as a diamond. I would not let him be the sole author of this story. I would not let his version of events be the only one that survived. If I was a ghost in my own life, then I would learn to haunt him. The next day, on my lunch break, I didn't eat the catered salad that arrived at my desk. I went out and walked to a cheap drugstore several blocks away, a place where no one from Vanguard would ever shop. I bought a pack of 3 spiral-bound notebooks, the kind a student would use, with plain blue, green, and red covers. They were anonymous, unremarkable, and perfect for my purposes. That night, in the silent grandeur of my new apartment, the ritual began. I opened the first notebook to the first page. With a simple ballpoint pen, I began to write. I wrote down everything. I started with the dinner at the Embers, reconstructing the conversation as best I could. I documented the assault, not with emotion, but with the cold, detached clarity of a police report. Then I worked backwards, detailing every late night, every inappropriate touch, every gift that was not a gift. I wrote down the exact date of my promotion and the precise figures of my salary increase. I wrote down the address of the company-leased apartment and the monthly cost, which I'd found on the paperwork Patricia had left for me. The act of writing was a reclamation. It was a quiet rebellion, a refusal to be gaslighted. The notebooks became the one place in the universe where the truth was allowed to exist, raw and unvarnished. They were my memory. They were my sanity. I filled page after page with my neat, controlled handwriting, and with each word I wrote, the despair receded, replaced by a sense of cold, clear purpose. I hid the notebooks in the most obvious place I could think of, inside a box of old college textbooks in the back of the spare bedroom closet. They were my secret, my power, my insurance policy against the man who thought he owned me. My chance to learn more came from his own hubris. About a month into my new role, Peterson called me into his office. He was in a magnanimous mood. "Emma," he said, smiling his benevolent leader smile, "I have a task for you, one that requires absolute discretion. My files from my time running the Chicago office are a complete disaster. They're taking up valuable space in the archives. I need someone to go through them, box by box, digitize anything of true importance, and arrange for the rest to be securely shredded. Frankly, you're the only person I trust to handle it." The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. He saw me as so thoroughly subjugated, so completely broken to his will, that he felt safe entrusting me with the unfiltered contents of his past. It was the critical mistake of a narcissist, the fatal overconfidence of a king who believes his subjects are no longer capable of independent thought. "Of course, Mr. Peterson," I said, my voice a perfect mask of quiet compliance. "I'd be happy to." The corporate archives were in the sub-basement of the building. a cold, windowless room that smelled of aging paper and chilled recycled air. It was a tomb, lined with rows of identical, gunmetal gray filing cabinets and shelves groaning under the weight of dozens of brown cardboard boxes. A single fluorescent light strip hummed overhead, casting a sterile, buzzing light over everything. For days, I worked in that silent, cold room. The task was as tedious as he'd promised. Box after box was filled with old contracts, expired leases, and financial reports from a decade ago. I worked methodically, sorting, scanning, and marking files for destruction, playing the part of the diligent, trustworthy assistant. My mind was sharp, alert, looking for anything that seemed out of place. I found it on the third day, in a box labeled Q4 Marketing Summaries. It was a simple, beige legal folder with no label. My heart began to beat a little faster. Inside was not a marketing summary, but a legal document, thick with the dense, impenetrable language of lawyers. It was a settlement and non-disclosure agreement. I scanned the pages, my eyes catching on phrases: confidential resolution, allegations of workplace harassment, creation of a hostile environment, no admission of liability. The parties involved were Vanguard Solutions and a woman named Catherine Mills. Her title was listed as Executive Assistant to the CEO. The settlement amount was staggering, enough to buy a house. The name, Catherine Mills, pricked at my memory, but I couldn't place it. I carefully put the folder back, my mind racing. The document itself was a bomb, proof that he had done this before. But there was something more here, a cold feeling that settled deep in my gut. Back in the safety of my isolated office, I did something I had never done before on a company computer. I opened a private browse window and typed Catherine Mills, Chicago into the search bar. The search results were sparse, but one hit stood out. It was a link to an online archive of a small, local Chicago newspaper. The article was short, just 2 paragraphs. It was an obituary. Catherine Mills, age 26, had died in a single-car accident on a deserted stretch of road outside the city. The police had ruled the accident a result of driver fatigue. My eyes scanned down to the date of publication. It was from a few years ago, just 3 months after the date on the settlement agreement I was holding in my hands. The air in my small office suddenly felt thin and cold. A coincidence? Perhaps, but my entire body screamed that it wasn't. A 26-year-old woman, fresh from a massive confidential settlement for harassment against a powerful man, dies in a convenient, unwitnessed accident? The narrative was too neat, too final. I wasn't just his latest victim. I was the survivor of a predator whose previous victim was dead. That evening, I stayed late, long after even Peterson had gone home. The building was a silent, hollow shell. I took the legal folder from the archives, my heart pounding with a terror so profound it was almost exhilarating. I didn't use the main high-volume copier outside Peterson's office. I went down 2 floors to the deserted marketing department, to a smaller, older machine tucked away in a supply closet. My hands shook as I laid each page flat on the glass, the bright, white light of the scanner flashing again and again, each flash searing the truth onto a new sheet of paper, a truth he thought he had buried forever. Back in my apartment, I slipped the copied documents into the back of my 3rd red notebook. I now had my story, and I had Catherine's. I was no longer just a victim documenting her own abuse. I was an archivist. I was the keeper of a ghost's story. Hiding the notebooks in their designated place, I felt a change settle deep within me. The fear was still there, a constant companion, but it was no longer the paralyzing fear of a cornered animal. It was the sharp, clarifying fear of a hunter who has just found the tracks of her prey. The ghost in the archives had given me a reason to fight and a weapon to fight with. My life was no longer the only one at stake. The discovery of Catherine Mills' story changed the chemical composition of my rage. It was no longer a personal, selfish anger, born of my own violation. It had become something larger, something colder and more righteous. I was no longer just fighting for myself. I was fighting for a ghost. This new purpose, however, did not make me feel strong. It made me feel heavy, burdened by a secret that was not entirely my own. In the quiet solitude of my gilded cage, I felt like a vessel for this dead woman's truth, and it was a terrifying responsibility. It was in this state of mind, several months into my pregnancy, that I was summoned home. My belly had begun to swell into a gentle but undeniable curve. I could no longer hide the physical reality of my situation with a well-placed blazer or a loose-fitting blouse. The secret was literally taking shape. The call came from my mother, her voice thin and strained over the phone. "Emma, dear, we haven't seen you in weeks. Your father, he's been asking. We'd like you to come for lunch on Sunday." It wasn't an invitation. It was a subpoena. My presence was required. Some small, foolish part of me, a part I thought had died in their living room months ago, felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, now that the situation was so visible, so real, my mother's maternal instincts would finally override her wifely duty. Maybe she would see me. The drive to Maple Creek was surreal. I felt like a visitor from another planet, an alien returning to a world where I once belonged. The perfect lawns, the identical mailboxes, the oppressive sense of order. It all seemed so fragile, so divorced from the raw, chaotic reality I was living. When my mother opened the door, her eyes did not meet mine. They went straight to my stomach, and I saw a flicker of something, not joy, not wonder, but a kind of pained revulsion, as if she were looking at a disfiguring scar. "Emma," she said, her smile so tight it looked like it might crack her face. "Come in, dear." My father was in the living room, reading the paper as always. He looked up, his eyes performing the same quick, dismissive scan of my body. He gave a curt nod. "Emma," was all he said, before pointedly turning back to his reading. There would be no performance of pride today. I was damaged goods, a failed investment he no longer wished to acknowledge. He retreated behind his wall of newsprint, abdicating his role, and leaving my mother to handle the unpleasantness. She was, as always, his designated emotional janitor. She led me into the kitchen, a place she always considered her domain, a place of supposed warmth and feminine confidence. She busied herself with making tea, her movements jerky and agitated. The silence was thick with unspoken words. "You're showing," she finally said, her back to me as she fussed with the kettle. "Yes," I replied, my hand instinctively going to my stomach. She turned around, her face a mask of anxious misery. "And you're still working for that man?" "It's a good job, Mother. You know how important the job is to Dad." I said it deliberately, a small, cruel test. Of course," she said quickly, flustered. "It's just, Emma, we need to talk about this, about the optics of the situation." I had come hoping, foolishly, to talk about my feelings, my fears, the baby. My mother wanted to talk about optics. She sat down at the small kitchen table, her hands twisting a tea towel into a tight knot. "The neighbors, Emma. Mrs. Henderson from across the street. She asked me the other day if you were expecting. I didn't know what to say. I was so embarrassed, I could have died." The heat of her shame radiated across the table. It was so much stronger than any concern she might have felt for me. My pregnancy wasn't a future grandchild, a new chapter for our family. It was a social inconvenience. It was a source of gossip. "What do you want me to do, Mother?" I asked, my voice flat. "I want you to be more careful," she hissed, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "You have to understand the stress this is putting on your father. His blood pressure. Dr. Evans was very clear at his last checkup. He needs to avoid any shocks, any undue agitation. This whole thing, it's not good for him. He's so proud of your career, and now this scandal is just, it's a lot for him to bear." There it was, the most poisonous arrow in her quiver. She was reframing my trauma, my violation, my impossible situation as a burden on my father's health. My pain was an inconvenience. My body was a threat to his well-being. I was not the victim here. He was. My father's cruelty was a blade. It was sharp, it was quick, and it was, in its own terrible way, honest. He wanted success and status, and I was his vehicle. My breakdown was a mechanical failure. His reaction was cold, but it was simple. My mother's cruelty, I realized in that moment, was a slow-acting poison. It was disguised as concern, wrapped in the language of care and family loyalty, and that's what made it so much more insidious. She was asking me to sacrifice myself on the altar of her husband's comfort. I saw him looking at you today, she continued, her voice dropping even lower. The way he looks at you now, with such disappointment. It breaks my heart. After all we've done for you, all the opportunities we've given you, how could you let this happen? How could you be so careless? Careless. She thought this was the result of carelessness. The naivety of it would have been laughable if it weren't so devastating. She lived in a world where powerful, charming men like Richard Peterson were to be admired, and young women who ended up pregnant were careless, foolish, and to blame. She could not, or would not, connect the two. To do so would be to admit that the world was not the safe, orderly place she needed it to be. To do so would be to question the very men her husband so admired. What you should do, she said, leaning forward, her face a conspiracy of whispers, is start wearing looser clothing. Tunics, A-line dresses, nothing that accentuates your condition. And perhaps it would be best if you didn't come to the family brunch at the club for a while, just until things settle down. She wasn't offering support. She was offering a strategy for concealment. She was my mother, and her only advice was to hide myself, to erase my own existence, so as not to cause a ripple in their perfect, placid pond. I looked at her. This small, anxious woman, her life's purpose reduced to managing her husband's moods and policing the family's reputation. And I felt nothing. The last, fragile thread of hope, of daughterly love, didn't just break. It sublimated, turning from a solid thing into thin, empty air. I finally saw her not as my mother, but as a functionary of my father's regime. She was not his victim. She was his willing accomplice, the warden of his prison of appearances. I understand, I said, and my voice was calm, so calm it scared me. She looked relieved. Good. I knew you would. You're a smart girl, Emma. Yes, I said, standing up from the table. I am. I understood that I was an orphan. Not because my parents were dead, but because they had chosen, actively and willingly, to sacrifice me for the sake of their own peace of mind. I understood that this house was not my home, and these people were not my family. They were the architects of my first cage, the one made of expectation and conditional love. Richard Peterson had simply built a new one around it. I left the kitchen without another word. I walked past the living room where my father was still hidden behind his paper, a king on a throne of willful ignorance. I did not say goodbye. As I drove away from Maple Creek for what I knew would be the last time, I put a hand on my stomach. The life inside me, this tiny, fluttering presence that had been the source of so much terror, now felt like an anchor in a raging sea. It was the only thing that was truly mine. It was not a scandal. It was not an inconvenience. It was my child, and in that moment I made a silent, solemn vow to the ghost of Catherine Mills and to the child I was carrying. I would not be silenced. I would not be erased, and I would not ever be careless again. The last tie to my past had been severed. I was finally free to declare war. The final, quiet closing of my mother's front door was the sound of my own liberation. The chains of daughterly obligation, of seeking approval from people incapable of giving it, didn't just break. They dissolved into dust. I drove away from Maple Creek, not with tears in my eyes, but with a cold, hard clarity in my soul. I was an island now, and the child growing inside me was its sole native inhabitant. All the bridges to the mainland had been burned, not by me, but for me. And in that isolation, I found a strange and terrible strength. My anger, which had been a secret, simmering thing, now demanded action. It was time to cast the first stone. For months, my journals and the copies of Catherine Mills' settlement had been my secret armor. Now I had to see if they could be forged into a sword. I knew I couldn't fight Richard Peterson alone. He existed in a world of power and influence I couldn't begin to navigate. I needed a guide, a translator, a weapon. I needed a lawyer. The thought itself was terrifying. The legal world was his world. He had a stable of high-priced corporate attorneys on retainer who could crush me without breaking a sweat. Going to a lawyer felt like a minnow declaring its intention to swallow a shark. Discretion was paramount. I couldn't just open a phone book or search online for best lawyer in Columbus. His name was too big, his reach too long. Instead, I began a different kind of search. Using the private browse window on my laptop late at night in my apartment, I delved into case archives, looking for small, independent practitioners who specialized in employment law, specifically wrongful termination and harassment suits. I looked for lawyers who had taken on big corporations and, if they hadn't won, had at least drawn blood. I was looking for a giant killer. The name Sarah Jenkins appeared on my third night of searching. She ran a small, two-person firm out of a modest office building in a neighborhood far from the gleaming towers of downtown. Her bio was brief and professional, but the list of her published case notes showed a pattern. She took on fights others wouldn't. She represented nurses against hospital conglomerates, factory workers against manufacturing giants. There was a quiet tenacity to her record. She was a fighter. I bookmarked the page and stared at the phone number for a full hour before my hand stopped shaking enough to pick up my phone. Our first call was a stilted, paranoid dance. I didn't give my name. I simply said I was an employee at a major downtown firm with a sensitive workplace issue. I was expecting to be routed to a paralegal, but a calm, perceptive voice answered directly. "And is this sensitive issue something you're prepared to discuss?" she asked. There was no judgment in her tone, only a quiet professionalism that was instantly calming. "I have documentation," I said, the words feeling enormous. "Documentation is a good place to start," she replied. "Why don't you come in? We can talk. No names, no obligations until you feel comfortable." Her office was everything Vanguard was not. It was on the second floor of an old brick building above a coffee shop. The space was cluttered but organized, filled with overflowing bookshelves, stacks of legal files tied with string, and a ficus tree that was leaning precariously towards the light. It smelled of paper and strong coffee. It was a room where actual work happened, not where images were curated. It was real. Sarah Jenkins herself was just as real. She was in her late 30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and dark hair pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail. She wore a simple blouse and trousers, no power suit, no intimidating jewelry. She shook my hand firmly and gestured for me to sit in a comfortable, slightly worn armchair. "Thank you for seeing me," I began, my voice trembling slightly. "You said you have documentation," she said, getting straight to the point, a quality I already admired. "That's the best place for us to start. Your story is important, but what you can prove is what matters." For the first time, I was going to share my secret. My hands shook as I opened my bag and took out the 3 spiral-bound notebooks. I placed them on the coffee table between us. Then, I took out the folded copies of Catherine Mills's settlement agreement. I laid them on top of the notebooks. It felt like I was laying my own heart on the table for her inspection. "My name is Emma Vance," I said. "I am a special assistant to the CEO of Vanguard Solutions, Richard Peterson." And then, I told her everything. Sarah didn't interrupt. She listened with an unnerving stillness, her eyes never leaving my face. When I finished, the silence in the room was profound. Then, without a word, she picked up the first notebook. For the next hour, she read. She read my neat, controlled script detailing the late nights, the gifts, the manipulation. She read my clinical description of the assault. She read my notes on the promotion, the apartment, the salary. Then she picked up the copied settlement and read that too, her expression growing more focused, more intense. Finally, she read the short, tragic obituary of Catherine Mills. When she was done, she carefully closed the notebook and placed the documents back on the table. She looked at me, and for the first time I saw something beyond her professional calm. It was a flicker of cold, hard anger. "First," she said, her voice even and firm, "I want you to hear this. I believe you. Every word. What was done to you was not just immoral. It was a campaign of systematic psychological abuse and assault. You are a victim of a predator. Do you understand that?" Tears I didn't know I had been holding back pricked at my eyes. To be believed. It was such a simple thing, but it felt like a floodgate opening. I could only nod, unable to speak. "Good," she said, her tone shifting back to business. "Now for the hard part, the truth." She leaned forward. "If you and I were to walk into a courtroom tomorrow and sue Richard Peterson for sexual assault, we would enter a world of pain you cannot imagine. It would be a classic, he said, she said, against a man with limitless resources and a sterling public reputation. His lawyers would portray you as a calculating, scorned lover. They would say you had a consensual affair and are now trying to extort him. They would subpoena your emails, your phone records, your friends. They would dig into every corner of your life until you had no secrets left. They would put you on the stand and tear you to shreds. And after all that, after dragging you and your child through that meat grinder, we might still lose. The words were a bucket of ice water, extinguishing the small flame of hope that had begun to burn. I felt myself deflate. But, she said, tapping a finger on the top notebook, you haven't just brought me a story of abuse, Emma. You've brought me his business model. My head snapped up. What? This, she said, her voice gaining a sharp, strategic edge. The promotion with the doubled salary right after you became pregnant. The company-leased luxury apartment. This isn't just a man covering his tracks. This is the misuse of corporate assets. This is a potential breach of his fiduciary duty to his shareholders. And this, she tapped the Catherine Mills settlement, this proves it's a pattern. A repeatable, financially documented pattern of behavior. This is his standard operating procedure for silencing his victims. She leaned back in her chair, a slow, dangerous smile touching her lips. So we change the game. This stops being a messy, emotional case about sexual assault. It becomes a clean, cold case about corporate governance and financial impropriety. A good lawyer doesn't always tell you to fight. A great lawyer shows you where your enemy has already built his gallows and hands you the lever. In that moment, Sarah Jenkins handed me the lever. We don't attack the man, she said, her eyes gleaming with a fierce intelligence. We attack the brand. We don't file a lawsuit. We create a situation where Richard Peterson becomes a greater liability to Vanguard Solutions than he is an asset. We create a problem that can't be solved with money or threats, a problem that spooks his board of directors and his investors. We make him a pariah in the world he values most. I left her office 2 hours later, the notebooks and the documents safely back in my bag. But I was carrying something new. A strategy, a plan, a sliver of hope that was sharper and more dangerous than anything I had felt before. The rage that had been a burning, useless weight in my gut was being channeled, focused, and aimed. I had found my weapon, and it wasn't a sword to charge with. It was a single, perfectly shaped stone aimed at the foundation of the glass house he lived in. And I was finally ready to throw it. The strategy Sarah Jenkins had given me was a dangerous and delicate thing, a map to a hidden war, and the first rule of that war was that my enemy could never know he was under attack. My rage, once a wild and untamed fire, had to be banked, hidden deep inside me, its heat channeled into a singular, cold purpose. I had to become the woman Richard Peterson believed he had created, a grateful, compliant, and broken thing. My survival and my revenge depended on the perfection of my performance. I returned to the 35th floor of Vanguard Solutions a changed woman, though no one would have known it. On the surface, I became the model of quiet efficiency. I managed the pointless strategic projects he assigned me with a diligence that bordered on worship. I anticipated his needs, having his preferred coffee on his desk before he arrived, summarizing articles I knew he'd want to read. I offered meek, grateful smiles whenever he inquired about my condition. My growing pregnancy became my greatest camouflage. To him, my swelling belly was the ultimate symbol of his conquest, a living testament to his power. He saw a vulnerable, maternal creature, her ambitions subsumed by the biological reality he had forced upon her. He never once saw the soldier in the fortress, sharpening her sword. He underestimated me. It was the most valuable gift he had ever given me. I lived a dual life. By day, I was his creature, the special assistant who seemed to have accepted her gilded cage. By night, in the sterile silence of my apartment, I was a strategist. I studied corporate governance, read shareholder reports, and had hushed, late-night phone calls with Sarah Jenkins. We weren't planning a crime. We were mapping his vulnerabilities. We were identifying the exact pillars that held up the temple of his reputation. His ego is his center of gravity, Emma, Sarah's voice would say, calm and steady through the phone. Everything he does is to feed it, to project an image of himself as a brilliant, benevolent patriarch. That's the pressure point. That's where we apply the force. The opportunity to do so arrived sooner and more perfectly than either of us could have hoped. It came, as all his gravest mistakes did, from a place of supreme, unassailable arrogance. It was the annual Columbus Children's Foundation Gala. It was the premier philanthropic event of the year, a massive affair that raised millions for pediatric care. And that year, the chairman of the event, the man whose face was on every invitation and press release, was Richard Peterson. For him, the gala was not about charity. It was his coronation. It was the one night of the year where he could publicly perform the role he had crafted for himself, the titan of industry with a heart of gold, the loving family man, the pillar of the community. His wife Eleanor, a woman with her own significant social standing, would be by his side, the perfect corporate spouse. It was the apex of his public relations strategy, the night his brand would shine its brightest. He called me into his office one morning, his eyes alight with a fervor I recognized. It was the same look he got when he was about to close a massive deal. "Emma," he said, gesturing for me to sit. "The gala. It is, without exaggeration, the most important public event of my year. It is my legacy project. Every detail must be flawless, from the seating charts to the ice sculptures. The event coordinator we hired last year was a disaster. I cannot afford any mistakes this time." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the air. He leaned forward, his expression one of profound trust and magnanimity. "I have decided to manage it in-house," he said, "and I'm putting you in charge of everything. You will be the sole organizer. You will have an unlimited budget and my full authority. There is no one else I trust with something this important." The room tilted slightly. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild, frantic rhythm. It was here, the perfect, unthinkable opportunity. He was so confident in his ownership of me, so convinced of my subjugation, that he was going to hand me the keys to his kingdom. He was going to let me build the stage upon which he would be publicly executed, and he was going to call it an honor. I met his gaze, my face a carefully constructed mask of awe and humility. "Mr. Peterson," I said, my voice soft. I don't know what to say. Of course. It would be an honor. His greatest weapon was his ego. He needed to be seen as a good man. I decided to give him the grandest stage possible to show the world exactly who he was. And so, my real work began. I became the Trojan horse. To the outside world, and especially to Peterson, I was the most dedicated event planner imaginable. I threw myself into the logistics with a ferocious energy he mistook for gratitude. I was brilliant at it. I negotiated with vendors, securing better deals than my predecessor. I charmed the hotel's event staff. I managed the RSVPs with ruthless efficiency. Peterson would review my progress in weekly meetings, beaming with pride. "I knew you were the one for the job, Emma," he'd say, patting my hand. Flawless. He saw my meticulous planning, my long hours, my obsession with detail. He didn't see what I was truly building. With every vendor I hired, every schedule I created, every name I added to the guest list, I was secretly laying a trap. I now had legitimate control over all the levers of his public image. The guest list was a treasure map of his vulnerabilities. I knew precisely where his largest investors would be seated, which table would host the members of his board of directors, and where Eleanor's circle of influential, gossiping friends would hold court. The media list was my new Bible. I cultivated relationships with the journalists from the city's business journal and the society pages. I was their friendly, helpful, and incredibly efficient point of contact. They trusted me, but the most critical lever of all was the technology. The gala was a multimedia affair, with massive screens on either side of the stage that would project presentations, videos celebrating the foundation, and, of course, a live feed of the speakers. I personally selected the audio-visual company, a young, eager firm called Digital Display Solutions. I spent hours with their lead technician, a young man named Ben, going over every technical detail. "I'm just so worried about a glitch," I'd tell him, putting a hand on my belly and feigning a wave of hormonal anxiety. Mr. Peterson would be mortified if anything went wrong. "Could you walk me through the contingency plans? Is there a backup system? How do we switch to a secondary source if the main presentation fails? Ben, eager to please his high-profile client, showed me everything. He showed me how their system could seamlessly switch between multiple inputs, how a simple keystroke could override the primary feed with a backup PowerPoint presentation, loaded onto a secondary laptop. He thought he was reassuring a nervous, pregnant event planner. He had no idea he was training a saboteur. In the final weeks leading up to the gala, I lived on a knife's edge of terror and exhilaration. I was the perfect vessel of his trust, the pregnant, loyal assistant, working tirelessly for his glory. I would sit in planning meetings with him and his wife, Eleanor, smiling and taking notes as she debated the shade of white for the tablecloths. She treated me with a kind of detached pity, the way one might treat a favored but unfortunate servant. Neither of them saw the woman who went home at night and, with Sarah Jenkins on the phone, crafted the simple, devastating questions that would be loaded onto that secondary laptop. The night before the gala, I stood alone in the center of the vast, empty ballroom. The tables were set with gleaming silverware and crystal. The stage was lit. The massive screens on either side were dark and silent, waiting. Everything was in its place. The entire edifice of Richard Peterson's public life was polished to a perfect shine, ready for its grand unveiling. And I, the quiet, unassuming woman in the shadows, held the single loose thread that would unravel it all. The horse was at the gates, filled with ghosts, and tomorrow they would open the gates and welcome it in. The night of the gala arrived on a wave of shimmering silk and false smiles. The grand ballroom of the hotel was transformed, a cavern of crystal and starlight where the city's powerful came to congratulate themselves on their own generosity. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low, confident hum of networking. I moved through the glittering crowd, a clipboard my shield and an earpiece my connection to the web I had so carefully spun. On the surface, I was the event's architect, a phantom in a simple black dress, ensuring every champagne flute was filled and every centerpiece was perfectly aligned. My mask was flawless. I was calm, I was efficient, I was invisible. Members of the Vanguard board, men who barely knew my name, stopped me to compliment the seamlessness of the evening. "Excellent work, Emma," one of them murmured, his eyes already scanning the room for a more important conversation. Eleanor Peterson, a vision in emerald green, gave me a tight, regal smile. "Richard was right to trust you, dear. It's all lovely." They saw a competent subordinate. They had no idea they were speaking to their own executioner. Beneath the placid exterior, my heart hammered a frantic, relentless rhythm against my ribs. My every nerve was alive, thrumming with a mixture of pure terror and crystalline adrenaline. My gaze kept flicking to the back of the room, to the raised audio-visual booth where Ben, the young technician, sat bathed in the glow of his monitors. We had run our final checks that afternoon. The secondary laptop was in place, its simple 3-slide presentation loaded and ready. Our signal was subtle. When the main award was presented, I would touch my left earring. That was all, a gesture of insignificance that would trigger an avalanche. Every time a wave of fear threatened to overwhelm me, I would close my eyes for a fraction of a second and summon a ghost. Catherine Mills. Her name was a prayer, a mantra, a sharpening stone for my resolve. I was not just doing this for me. I was doing this for the woman he had buried under a mountain of money and a lie about driver fatigue. Tonight, I was giving her a voice. The evening progressed exactly as planned. The dinner was served, the silent auction raised a record amount, and the speeches were mercifully brief. Then came the main event. The president of the Children's Foundation took the stage to present the final award of the evening. "And now," he boomed, his voice echoing through the ballroom, "it is my distinct honor to present the Philanthropist of the Year award to a man whose commitment to this city and to its children is second to none, a true titan of industry with an even bigger heart, Mr. Richard Peterson." The room erupted in applause. Peterson rose from his seat at the head table, basking in the adoration. He kissed Eleanor on the cheek and strode to the stage with the easy confidence of a king ascending his throne. He accepted the heavy crystal award, holding it up to the light as cameras flashed. He was radiant, powerful, untouchable. He began his speech, his voice smooth and resonant, filling every corner of the room. He spoke of his humble beginnings. He spoke of the duty of the fortunate to give back. He spoke of family, of integrity, of the values that built strong communities. It was a masterpiece of hypocrisy, and the crowd absorbed every word. "But a man is nothing without his team," he said, his voice lowering with practiced humility. "And I have been blessed with the best." He smiled, his gaze sweeping the room before landing on me, standing in the shadows by the side of the stage. Tonight's flawless event, for example, was organized by my indispensable assistant, a young woman with a truly brilliant future. She has worked tirelessly, even as she prepares for a new chapter as a mother herself. Please join me in thanking the incredible Emma Vance, he gestured to me. A spotlight found my face. The applause was polite, perfunctory. I felt hundreds of pairs of eyes on me, on my swelling belly. He was using me as his final prop, the loyal, pregnant protégé, another testament to his benevolent mentorship. I met his smiling, patronizing gaze from across the room. My hand, steady as stone, rose and touched my left earring. I gave a small, grateful nod to the crowd and to him. Ben, in the AV booth, saw the signal. Peterson turned back to the audience, ready to deliver his closing remarks. The massive screens on either side of him were displaying the elegant blue and gold logo of the Children's Foundation, and then they flickered. A low murmur rippled through the audience. A technical glitch. People shifted in their seats. Peterson paused, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. He glanced over his shoulder at the screens. The logo was gone. For a horrifying second, the screens were black, and then new images resolved on them. Not a video, not a logo, but clean, simple white text on a black background. Slide 1. A question for the Vanguard board. Why was company policy bypassed to lease a private residence for a junior employee in the autumn of last year? The murmur in the room grew, a sound of confusion, not alarm. People squinted, trying to make sense of the non sequitur. Peterson had frozen, his mouth slightly agape. He was still staring at the screen, his mind clearly struggling to catch up with the sudden derailment of his triumph. Before the question could fully register, before he could speak, the slide dissolved and was replaced by the next. Slide 2. A question for our host. Can you clarify the terms of the confidential settlement with former assistant Catherine Mills of your Chicago office? The name hung in the air, stark and damning. Catherine Mills. The silence that followed was not a quiet one. It was a roar. It was the sound of 500 conversations stopping at once. The collective clinking of forks and glasses ceased. The low hum of the room was gone, sucked into a vacuum of pure, unadulterated shock. From my vantage point, I could see the chain reaction. I saw the men at the Vanguard board members' table turn to each other, their faces pale, their expressions a mixture of panic and fury. They were not thinking of morality. They were thinking of shareholder lawsuits and stock prices. I saw the business reporters in the back, their heads down, their thumbs flying across the screens of their phones. They smelled blood. And I saw Eleanor. Her perfect, poised smile had collapsed, as if her facial muscles had been cut. She stared at the screen, and I watched her process the name Catherine Mills alongside the phrase confidential settlement. Her head turned slowly to look at her husband on the stage. The look in her eyes was not one of sadness or betrayal. It was the cold, reptilian fury of a queen who has just been publicly humiliated beyond all measure. In that moment, their marriage turned to ash. As Peterson stood paralyzed, the final slide appeared. Slide 3. A question for our investors. Is it standard practice for a CEO's special assistant to receive a 200% salary increase outside of normal review cycles? It was over. I didn't need to scream my truth. I just needed to ask the right questions in a room full of people who had the most to lose. I had not accused him of a single crime. I had simply held up a mirror to his secret business practices, and done so in front of the only people whose judgment he feared, his financial equals. He had not been ruined by a victim's emotional testimony. He had been ruined by what looked like an anonymous and very meticulous shareholder audit. While the silent nuclear fallout was spreading through the room, I set my clipboard and headset down on an empty table. No one was looking at me anymore. All eyes were on the imploding man on the stage. I turned, and with the ghost of Catherine Mills walking beside me, I slipped out a side door and into the cool, quiet anonymity of the night. I didn't look back. I didn't need to watch the temple fall. I had already lit the fuse. I did not stay to watch the fire. A saboteur who lingers at the scene of the explosion is a fool, and I had learned, through a brutal education, not to be a fool. While the grand ballroom was still paralyzed in a state of suspended, silent chaos, I was already out the door and in a waiting taxi. My headset lay on a linen-covered side table, a relic from a life that was already over. My first and only stop was the Gilded Cage. The apartment at the residences at Northgate was silent, a tomb of someone else's taste. I moved with a speed and efficiency that felt detached, as if I were watching another woman on a screen. I did not pack the expensive clothes he had indirectly bought me or the beautiful objects that furnished the rooms. I took only one thing of value: a small, sturdy travel bag containing 3 spiral-bound notebooks, a folder of copied legal documents, my laptop, and the ultrasound photo of my child that I kept hidden in my underwear drawer. Everything else was just scenery. Within 30 minutes, I was gone. I left the keys on the polished granite countertop, a final, quiet act of severance. By the time the first wave of panicked calls from Vanguard's board members began lighting up Richard Peterson's phone, I was already on a late-night bus heading north, a ghost dissolving into the darkness of the highway. I watched his empire crumble from a small, furnished, month-to-month rental in a city where no one knew my name, paid for with the extravagant salary he himself had given me. It was the last perfect irony. I became a connoisseur of the fallout, observing it through the cool, dispassionate lens of my laptop screen. The initial news reports were cautious, bewildered. They called the gala incident a bizarre corporate prank or a sophisticated hack. They focused on the spectacle, the public embarrassment. But the questions my slides had posed were like a slow-acting acid. They couldn't be ignored. The business journalists were the first to dig deeper. They didn't have to find answers. They just had to report on the questions themselves. A headline in the Columbus Business Chronicle read, "Gala Controversy Puts Vanguard Solutions, CEO Under Scrutiny." The article was carefully worded, filled with phrases like "sources close to the board" and "alleged financial irregularities." It mentioned in its 10th paragraph the name Catherine Mills, noting that a former employee of that name had died some years prior and that the company declined to comment on the nature of her departure. It was enough. The seed was planted in the public record. The first card to fall from Peterson's house was the one he thought was most secure: his marriage. 3 days after the gala, Eleanor Peterson's lawyer released a crisp, one-sentence statement to the press. Mrs. Eleanor Peterson has filed for divorce from her husband, citing irreconcilable differences, and will be making no further comment. It was a social execution. In their world, a wife's loyalty was the ultimate measure of a man's character. Eleanor's swift, public abandonment was a signal to their entire class that Richard was not just compromised, he was toxic. She was cutting her losses, saving the only brand she truly cared about, her own. The second and most decisive blow came from within. Vanguard Solutions, faced with a plummeting stock price and a deluge of inquiries from nervous investors, did what all corporations do in a crisis. They circled the wagons to protect the institution, not the man. A press release announced that the board of directors had launched a full, independent internal investigation into recent allegations concerning corporate governance and the use of company funds. It also announced that Mr. Richard Peterson would be taking a voluntary leave of absence, effective immediately, to cooperate fully with the investigation and to spend time with his family. I had a final, brief phone call with Sarah Jenkins. Her voice was calm and clinical, the voice of a surgeon who had just completed a complex and successful operation. "They're not investigating the assault, Emma," she explained. "They don't care about that. They're investigating the money, the unapproved lease on your apartment, the off-cycle salary increase, and now they're digging into the Chicago settlement. You gave them a clean, fireable offense. You gave them a way to get rid of him without getting their hands dirty with the messier truth." "So he won't face any real justice?" I asked, a part of me still clinging to a conventional idea of consequences. "This is the only kind of justice he understands," Sarah replied gently. "They're not taking away his freedom, they're taking away his power. For a man like Richard Peterson, that's a fate worse than prison." They didn't do it because he was a monster, Emma. They did it because he was bad for business. You understood that. That's why you won. The end, when it came, was quiet and bloodless. 2 weeks later, another press release. Vanguard Solutions announced the resignation of its CEO. They thanked him for his years of visionary leadership and wished him well in his future endeavors. It was a bland corporate epitaph for a man they had just brutally and efficiently erased. He was forced out with a stripped-down severance package and an ironclad non-disclosure agreement that ensured he would never be able to tell his side of the story without facing financial ruin. He had been silenced by the same tool he had used on Catherine Mills. He tried to find me. A private investigator I had anticipated, and Sarah had warned me about, made inquiries at my old apartment building in Columbus and even drove out to my parents' house in Maple Creek. But there was no trail to follow. I had resigned from my position via a simple email sent the morning of the gala. My company-leased apartment was empty. The phone number I had used was a prepaid burner that now lay at the bottom of a river. Emma Vance, the special assistant, had ceased to exist. He had no leverage, no connection, no power over me anymore. I had become a ghost, just as he had made Catherine. He lost everything. Not because of what he did to me, not because he was a predator who destroyed women. He lost it all because the men in suits who sat on his board looked at a spreadsheet and decided he was no longer a profitable asset. He had become a rounding error, a liability to be written off. In the end, it was always just business. Staring at the sterile corporate statement on my laptop screen, I felt not triumph, not joy, not even the satisfaction of revenge. I felt a profound and quiet stillness. The demolition was complete. The ground was finally clear. The demolition of Richard Peterson's life was not a victory I celebrated with champagne. There was no elation, no fist pump of triumph. I observed his downfall from afar with the grim, quiet satisfaction of a bomb disposal expert watching a controlled explosion. The threat had been neutralized. The world was safer. That was all. My focus had already shifted. It had to. Because 6 weeks after the last news report announcing Peterson's resignation, my son was born. I named him Leo. It meant lion. It felt right. He arrived in the quiet, anonymous ward of a hospital in a city where no one knew my story. He was small, perfect, and incandescently real. The moment they placed him in my arms, the ghosts that had haunted me for so long, the ghost of Catherine Mills, the ghost of the woman I used to be, even the ghost of Richard Peterson, all of it receded, banished by the overwhelming, ferocious, and utterly unconditional love I felt for this tiny, helpless person. He was not a consequence. He was not a secret. He was my son. And my life, which had been a tangled narrative of survival and revenge, simplified into a single, crystalline purpose. Him. Our life was small and quiet. We lived in a simple 2-bedroom apartment with secondhand furniture. My days were a gentle, repetitive rhythm of feedings, diaper changes, and long walks in the park. The vast sums of money I had saved from my Vanguard salary I now guarded with a dragon's ferocity, using it sparingly to build a safe, stable world for Leo. I was no longer Emma Vance, the rising star, or the vengeful victim. I was Leo's mother. It was the only title that mattered. I had thought the book of my past was closed forever. But there was one final chapter I knew I had to write myself, one last loose end that needed to be tied off, not with anger, but with a final, clean cut. My mother had been leaving weeping, frantic voicemails on the new, untraceable phone number I had established for emergencies. Her messages were a rambling litany of her own misery. My father was bitter and withdrawn. The neighbors were whispering. Her social life was in ruins. She never once asked if I was okay, or if the baby had been born healthy. Her pain, as always, was a black hole that consumed everything around it. For months I ignored the calls. But I knew that their unresolved story would be a shadow clinging to the edges of the new life I was trying to build for my son. To be truly free, I had to face them one last time, not as their daughter, but as an equal. I finally answered the phone and agreed to a meeting. We met in a sterile, roadside coffee shop off a highway, a non-place located at the exact halfway point between my new life and my old one. It was a place with no memories, no history, perfect for a final transaction. I arrived first, Leo sleeping peacefully in a carrier strapped to my chest. I chose a booth in the back corner and ordered a black coffee. I was calm. The frightened girl who had pleaded for their help 9 months ago was gone forever. The woman who sat there, waiting, was a mother, and there is no armor on earth more formidable. They walked in together, looking older and smaller than I remembered. The world had shrunk them. My father's confident stride was gone, replaced by a sullen shuffle. My mother looked frail, her face a web of anxious lines. Their eyes immediately landed on me, then on the small, sleeping bundle on my chest. My mother's face crumpled, and she began to cry silently before she even reached the table. My father's face hardened into a mask of bitter resentment. He didn't see a grandson. He saw the living embodiment of his humiliation, the final, undeniable proof of the scandal that had torched his ambitions. "So," he said, his voice a low, gravelly thing, as he slid into the booth opposite me. "There it is." My mother sat beside him, dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. "Oh, Emma," she whispered, "to think, a grandchild, and this is how it is." I said nothing. I simply looked at them, letting their reactions wash over me without touching me. I was an observer behind thick glass. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" my father snarled, his voice low and venomous. "The gossip. The phone calls. I can't even show my face at the club without people whispering behind their hands. They look at me, and all they see is the scandal you brought on this family. The scandal you brought on this family." He had cast me as the villain in his story so completely that he actually believed it. In his mind, Richard Peterson was just a powerful man who had the bad luck of being associated with me, the troublemaker. My father's denial was a fortress, impenetrable and absolute. "Your father's health has been terrible," my mother chimed in, her tears giving her voice a wet, pleading quality. "The stress of it all. He barely sleeps. You've broken his heart, Emma." I looked at my father, at his angry, bitter face, and I felt nothing but a profound and weary pity. His heart wasn't broken. His ego was. He was a man mourning the death of his own reflection. This was the unsent letter. This was the moment where the old me would have screamed, would have cried, would have thrown the truth of Peterson's abuse in their faces, a litany of accusations and pain. I had rehearsed that letter in my head 1,000 times in the darkest hours of the night. But the woman sitting in that booth, the mother of the sleeping child on her chest, had no need for it. Yelling at them would be like yelling at the tide for coming in. It was pointless. They were incapable of understanding, and I no longer required their understanding. I let them exhaust their anger and their sorrow. I let them perform their grief for the life they thought they were owed. When they finally fell silent, the air thick with their misery, I spoke. My voice was quiet, calm, and steady. "I didn't ask you here to relitigate the past," I said. "I came here to inform you of the future. I am in the process of legally changing my name. My son will be given this new name at the same time. It has no connection to Vance. It has no connection to Peterson. It is my own." I watched their faces as the words landed. My mother looked utterly bewildered, as if I had just started speaking a foreign language. My father stared at me, his blustering anger momentarily replaced by a look of stunned comprehension. He finally understood. This wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't a plea for reconciliation. It was a declaration of independence, absolute and final. He hadn't just lost his investment. His name, the one thing he had passed on to me, was being returned to him, unwanted. His legacy, his story, would die with him. I saw my father one last time. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, I just looked at him, and he knew he had lost me. Sometimes, silence is the sharpest condemnation of all. I slid out of the booth, my movements smooth and unhurried. I adjusted the carrier on my chest, my hand resting protectively on Leo's warm, sleeping back. "Goodbye," I said. It was not a word of anger or of sadness. It was a statement of fact. A closing. I walked out of the coffee shop and did not look back. I left them there, 2 ghosts trapped in a past I no longer inhabited, adrift in the wreckage of a dream that had never been mine. As I buckled my son into his car seat, the sun felt warm on my face. The road ahead was unknown, but for the first time in my life, It was entirely my own. The book of my childhood was closed. The last letter, delivered but unsent, had been understood. A new book was beginning, and its first chapter was a name of my own choosing. The scent of damp earth is the smell of forgiveness. Not forgiveness for others, but for the world itself, for its capacity for cruelty and its equal capacity for renewal. I feel it now, crumbling the rich, dark soil between my fingers. It is the scent of my own life, the one I built with my own 2 hands, seed by seed, year by year. My garden is my sanctuary, my memoir, my testament. Each flower that pushes its way through the dirt is a word in a story of survival. The roses, with their beautiful, fragrant heads and their sharp, hidden thorns, are perhaps the most honest storytellers of all. I am an old woman now. The face that looks back at me from the reflection in the glass of the greenhouse is a map of a long journey. The lines around my eyes are from squinting into the sun and from decades of laughter. The lines around my mouth are from moments of sorrow and from a lifetime of smiling at my son. It is a good face. It is my own. Sometimes, in the quietest hours of the night, I think of the ghosts of my past. I think of my parents. I never saw them again after that day in the coffee shop. I learned, years later from a distant cousin who found me through a public records search, that my father had died of a heart attack a few years after our last meeting. My mother, I was told, had faded, becoming a recluse in the house that was her own sterile prison, before passing away in her sleep. I did not mourn them. I had already done my mourning on the day I realized they loved an idea of me more than me myself. My only feeling was a distant, quiet pity for 2 people who had chosen the cold comfort of appearances over the messy, vibrant warmth of love. They had tended a house, but they had never cultivated a home. And Richard Peterson. I searched his name online once, about 20 years ago, out of a strange, detached curiosity. I found very little. His spectacular fall from grace had been followed by an equally spectacular fade into obscurity. There was a record of a failed business venture, a messy divorce from a second wife, and then nothing. He became a non-person, a ghost in the digital archives, the worst possible fate for a man who needed the world's adoration to feel real. His punishment was not a jail cell, but a long, irrelevant life spent in the shadow of the colossus he had once been. I never wished him ill. I simply never wished him anything at all. He had become, like my parents, a closed book on a dusty shelf. My life was too full of new stories to bother rereading the old ones. The real story, the one that mattered, was the one I built from the ashes. People, the few who know the barest outlines of my past, sometimes ask if I regret my child's origins. They ask it in hushed, careful tones, as if the very question might wound me. I always smile. A flower is not defined by the soil it came from, but by the garden it's tended in. He was a product of violence, but he was raised in love, my love. That was my victory. It wasn't the day Peterson lost his job. It was the first time my son laughed. It wasn't the moment the slides appeared on the screen. It was the moment he took my hand and called me Mom. That was the real unveiling. The sound of a car door closing pulls me from my reverie. I look up, my heart lifting as it always does. A man is walking up the garden path, a man with my eyes and a kind, easy smile that is all his own. He is tall and confident, but his strength is a quiet, gentle thing, not the brittle, demanding power of the men I once knew. This is Leo. My son, my lion. There you are, he says, his voice full of warmth. I figured I'd find you out here, communing with the dirt. The dirt is a much better conversationalist than most people, I reply, smiling as I pull off my gardening gloves. He leans down and kisses my cheek. Behind him, his wife, a wonderful woman with a laugh that could make flowers bloom, is helping their own small daughter out of the car. My granddaughter. Her name is Lily. "Grandma!" Lily shouts, her little legs pumping as she runs towards me, her pigtails flying behind her. I open my arms and she crashes into me, a bundle of pure, uncomplicated joy. I lift her up, her small body light in my arms, and she smells of sunshine and graham crackers. This is the harvest. This is the yield from the seeds I planted so long ago in the frozen soil of my own despair. We spend the afternoon in the garden, Leo helps me stake the tall delphiniums. His wife helps Lily identify ladybugs on the rose bushes. We drink lemonade on the porch and talk about nothing and everything. Their love is an easy, comfortable thing, a well-worn sweater, and they wrap me in its warmth. Later, as the sun begins to set, casting long golden shadows across the lawn, Leo finds me standing by the bed of winter jasmine. "You know," he says quietly, standing beside me, "I was talking to a colleague the other day. He was complaining about his parents, about all the pressure they put on him to succeed." He pauses, then looks at me. "Thank you for never doing that. Thank you for just letting me be me." I look at my son, this good, kind man, and my heart is so full it feels like it might burst. "Oh, my love," I say, my voice thick with emotion. "Letting you be you was the easiest and best thing I have ever done." He squeezes my shoulder, and we stand there in comfortable silence, watching the last rays of sunlight paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. My revenge was never about a single act of destruction. It was about the slow, deliberate, and lifelong act of creation. It was about building this garden. It was about raising this man. It was about creating a life so full of light that the old shadows had no place to hide. As Lily runs over and takes my hand, her small, warm fingers fitting perfectly into my own, I look around at the world I have made, a world of flowers and family, of love and laughter. It is a quiet life, an unremarkable life to some, perhaps. But to me, it is a miracle. He took my spring and left me in a world of ice, but he didn't know. You can learn to be a gardener in the winter, and in the harshest, coldest, most unforgiving soil, if you tend it with enough love, something beautiful will grow.